Like and subscribe right now, or this spider will crawl in your face while you're sleeping.
Funerals give us the chance to grieve the death of our loved ones and are often fraught with tense emotions. Given the high tensions and sometimes shocking revelations that can occur at these gatherings, it might be considered something of a blessing in disguise that we are present in body only. Unsurprisingly, few people live to see their own funeral. Most are long dead before the ceremony begins. However, the following people each manage to witness their own life's memorial, either by choice or by bizarre chance. So without any further ado, here are 10 times people woke up at their own funeral. Let's go. Number 10. Essie Dunbar. In 1915, 32-year-old Essie Dunbar was declared dead after suffering a fit of epilepsy. Her body was put into a coffin and slated for burial at 11 a.m. the next day. She would have been buried earlier, but the delay was necessary to allow her sister, who lived in the next town, to see her corpse one last time. Essie's sister did not make the burial in time despite the length of the ceremony. She appeared a few minutes after the body was lowered into the grave, but it was quickly exhumed to allow her to pay her last respects. The supposedly dead Essie sat up in her coffin and smiled at her sister. The 3 ministers who oversaw the burial fell into the grave, and one suffered 3 broken ribs when the other 2 clambered over him to escape. The 3 ministers fled the scene with Essie's sister and the rest of the burial party. Essie herself didn't help the matter. She ran after the burial party as they fled into the town and caused a commotion. Years later, people still believe that Essie was a zombie that returned from the dead. She died in 1955, though some accounts of a mention in 1962. A newspaper announced her death with a catchy headline, "Second funeral is held for South Carolina woman."
Before we move on, I've got a little challenge for you that will take just 5 seconds to complete. So here's the deal. You just leave a like on this video, smash that subscribe button, and hit the notification bell and you get 25 years of amazing logic. Try it. It really works.
Number 9. Matthew Wall. The village of Browing, Hertfordshire, celebrates Old Man's Day on October 2nd every year. The celebration is not a remembrance of old men, but Matthew Wall, who was almost buried alive on October 2nd, 1571. Matthew Wall was preparing for his marriage when he died, or rather was presumed to have died. He was being carried to the village church in a coffin when one of the pallbearers slipped on some wet leaves and dropped the casket. The shock awoke Wall from his coma, and he started banging on the coffin, screaming to be let out. He went on to get married, have 2 sons, and live for 24 more years. He died in 1595. In his will, Wall requested that the church bell should be rung for a funeral and a wedding on the 2nd day of October every year. He also requested that Fleece Lane, where the pallbearer had slipped, should be swept free of leaves. The request seemed odd since it was the leaves that prevented his premature burial. The people of Browing still execute his will today. On the 2nd day of October, they ring the church bell as he requested, while the priest and local children sweep the lane. Number 8. Mrs. Blunden. Hampshire resident Mrs. Blunden had the misfortune of being declared dead and waking up in her coffin twice. On July 15, 1674, she took ill and fell into a deep sleep after taking some poppy water. Her body became cold, she wasn't breathing, she had no pulse or heartbeat. She was declared dead and was buried against the wishes of her husband, who was away on a trip and wanted her buried on his return. Mrs. Blunden's body was exhumed after some children playing around the graveyard complained about hearing sounds coming from her grave. She had awoken in her coffin, and her body was covered in wounds and scratches from her attempts to escape. She was now still, however. No signs of life were detected, and she was declared dead again and reburied. Mrs. Blunden was found with more injuries on her body when she was exhumed again to allow a coroner's inspection the next day. She had also bitten her mouth until it was bloody and had torn her clothes. A guard was posted at her grave and should have detected when she awoke again, but he claimed he didn't. It is speculated that he left the graveside. Number 7. Felix Bush Breziale. Well, this is a bizarre one, as the person in question here didn't wake up at his funeral, rather he planned. Just hold on, we can explain. You see, Felix Breziale spent 5 years planning his own funeral, as he'd never married or had many friends. Breziale was eager to hear what the preacher had to say about him. His bizarre funeral in 1938 gained national attention and 8,000 people attended. Vendors sold soft drinks and hot dogs, and the spectacle had a carnival-like atmosphere. Breziale arrived in a hearse, seated next to the driver. Guests mobbed him when he stepped out of the vehicle. Breziale needed help to state troopers to get inside the funeral tent. He sat in a chair next to his self-made coffin, and he listened to the preacher give a eulogy. Hundreds of people approached him after the ceremony. Breziale shook their hands and he signed autographs. He was pleased with the service, and he said it was the nicest thing he had attended. Breziale died 5 years later in 1943. As he requested, no funeral was given. Number 6. Margaret Maggie Dickinson. On September 2nd, 1721, Margaret Maggie Dickinson was tried and hanged for concealing her pregnancy. The Edinburgh woman was separated from her husband and had taken a job at an inn, where she started an affair with the son of the owner. The affair led to her getting pregnant, but she hid it because she didn't want to lose her job. The baby she birthed was too weak and died a few days later. Margaret could not bury the child since the pregnancy had been a secret, and so she dumped it into a river. Unfortunately, the body was found along the riverbank the same day and was traced back to her. Maggie was hanged at the gallows, and her body was put inside a coffin. She woke up while being transported to a graveyard 10 kilometers away. Margaret's supposed resurrection had taken an act of God, and it was assumed that God had given her a second chance at life and forgiven her for her crime. She got back with her husband and had more children. She was nicknamed Half-Hangit Maggie. Number 5. Unarmed French Gendarme. On March 17, 1889, the Press Democrat reported the story of a French gendarme, or as we call them, police officer, who was almost buried alive. The unnamed gendarme, living near Grenoble, France, had gone into a trance-like sleep after drinking too much potato brandy. He slept for a whole day before his friends noticed that his body became rigid, as would be expected of a dead person. The unfortunate gendarme was declared dead but awoke as he was being lowered into a grave. He banged on the coffin, demanding to be let out. The undertakers lowering him into grave immediately stopped the burial and quickly opened the casket. However, it was all for nothing as the gendarme hit his head on the coffin and died. Number 4. Eleanor Markham. In 1894, Eleanor Markham was declared dead in her village of Sprakers, New York. She had complained of heart problems 2 weeks earlier and was being attended by one Dr. Howard. Her health continued declining until the morning of July 8, 1894, when Dr. Howard declared her dead. Her death certificate was issued, and 2 days later, she was put into a coffin in preparation for a burial. Eleanor woke and made a noise as her coffin was being carried into the vehicle that would have taken her to the ceremony. The coffin was opened, and a surprised Eleanor exclaimed that she was about to be buried alive. Dr. Howard, who was among the burial party, quickly calmed her down, assuring her that the error will be corrected. Eleanor later stated that she was conscious all through the preparation for her burial and could hear everything being discussed, even down to whispers. Number 3. Unnamed 3-year-old boy. On April 25, 1913, an unnamed 3-year-old son of Mrs. J. Burney sat up in his coffin as he was about to be buried in Butte, California. The boy stared straight at his grandmother, 81-year-old Mrs. L. Smith, who immediately died in shock. The boy became unconscious and fell back into the coffin. A doctor later declared him dead. The boy's story sounds like that of a Kevin Santos, a 2-year-old Brazilian boy who was almost buried alive in 2012. Santos sat up in his coffin just before his burial and asked his father for some water before falling back into the coffin. He could not be resuscitated and was declared dead a second time. Now get ready for today's top pick. At spot number 2, Octavia Hatcher. In January 1891, James and Octavia Hatcher lost their only son, Jacob. Octavia fell in depression after Jacob's death and refused to leave her bed. She soon took ill and fell into a coma before being declared dead on May 2nd, 1891. She was buried immediately. A few days later, her husband's family noticed that several other townspeople who had just been in comas were recovering and waking up. The local legends state that Octavia had been afflicted with a sleeping sickness, which was caused by the bite of the tsetse fly. James and his family, suspecting that they had buried a living woman, raced to the grave and dug it up. They were too late. Octavia had woken in her coffin and tried getting out, but couldn't. The inner lining of the coffin was torn, and her hands were covered with blood. James reburied her and erected a monument of her holding baby Jacob over the grave. Residents around Pikeville, Kentucky cemetery claim to hear sounds of a crying woman or kitten coming from Octavia's grave. Some even say that her statue faces the opposite direction on her burial anniversary. Some vandals also entered the cemetery and vandalized the arm holding the baby. It remains at the foot of the monument today. James, fearing that he might be buried alive himself, ordered a custom-made coffin long before his death. The coffin could be opened from the inside to allow him to escape if he was ever buried alive. Number 1. Madame Bobbin. On November 16, 1901, the Hereford Times reported the story of one Madame Bobbin who died of a yellow fever after arriving in the city of Palacan, France, from Senegal. Her body had stiffened and her face had turned ashen. She was promptly buried. A nurse who saw Madame Bobbin before her burial reported that she was not as cold as expected and claimed to have noticed little movements in the muscles of her abdomen. She suggested that Madame Bobbin might not be dead and may have been buried alive. Madame Bobbin's father had the body exhumed and was shocked to see that her daughter had birthed a child inside of the coffin. An autopsy revealed that she did not have yellow fever and was alive at the time of the burial. She suffocated to death inside the grave. Her family sued and was awarded 8,000 francs. Thank you so much for watching today's video. We hope that you enjoyed it, and please stay tuned for some more great content.